120. Good morning, good chodesh. Good to see you all. Okay, we are on page 120, and we are going to begin a new topic. We skipped over a certain section in the last, a certain topic in the last section, which we're going to come back to. I think the order, I would have ordered it a little bit differently, so we'll come back to a section that we skipped over in case you noticed that. But we're going to get into a topic known as shehiyah. Shehiyah essentially is this. What happens going into Shabbos? Shehiyah is all about scenarios where you have food that is not fully cooked, that you want to leave on your hot plates, on your oven as Shabbos begins. Page 120. Okay, may I have asked him. So, basically you're coming into Shabbos and you have food that is not fully cooked. So let's say you have a chicken soup. You're running around Erev Shabbos, now it's the summertime, so we all walk into Shabbos all comfortable and relaxed. Just kidding. Okay, but in the winter, we certainly are not walking into Shabbos all comfortable and relaxed. Oftentimes you're running chaotically and you're just running around. So you have, you made a chicken soup. It's not fully cooked. You just threw all the stuff in and you didn't have enough time. So you crank up the oven, but it's not fully cooked. You're allowed to leave that on the oven as Shabbos begins. You have a chicken, or whatever it is, you cook for Shabbos, and someone told you, I have a bunch more guests coming. Oh no, what do? I don't have enough chicken. So I quickly go ahead and I grab some schnitzel out of the freezer, or whatever it is, and I want to throw it into the oven, and it's not fully cooked, right? Am I allowed to leave this food baking, as Shabbos begins, with the oven running on Shabbos with the food that's not fully cooked or fully baked? Am I allowed to, or perhaps the most common case, is I make a cholent. A cholent takes a while till it's somewhat edible, right? And how much before Shabbos do I have to prepare my cholent? Can I go ahead right before Shabbos and prepare my cholent? Can I do it an hour before Shabbos? These are all the different things we're going to be discussing today. And the term that we're going to use is something called shehiyah. Shehiyah, we'll see what it's defined as, but essentially it means like to leave something on a fire when Shabbos begins. That's the idea behind it. We're going to begin on page 120 with a short overview of the sugya, of the topic, from a summary written by the Mishnah Brura, again on page 120, source number 1 on the bottom of the page. Okay, so he says like this: Hinei mipnei shasimen hazeh rabu pei rosav. Since this topic this chapter really has many details, and in order to ensure that the person reading this does not get too confused, amarti lahatik, we're now on page 121, amarti lahatik me sefer machtis hashekel psicha ketana eleha. I figured it would make sense to copy a little bit from this book called Machtis HaShekel. It's a halachic book. A short introduction, Meikare Adinim Shalah, from the main laws that we're going to be discussing, Kedei Sheyarot HaKorebo, so that the reader will be familiar with the different details. So we're about to get a short summary of the general topic. As we'll see, there are different opinions which further complicate this topic, okay? It says like this: Dash yesh inyan shehiyah ve'inyan chazara. There are two major topics which come up on Shabbos itself, things that we could do, but they have to be done with very specific parameters. One is called shehiyah, as we'll see, which is leaving things on the fire. The other is chazara, which literally means to return, which means, as he'll define in a moment, I take something off of a fire and I return it. Okay, so it's like this: Shehiyah mikri is called shenosin tafshel me'erev Shabbos al gabe kira. It's shehiyah is when I place an item on a kira, is a type of oven, but it just means an oven. I put something on an oven before Shabbos begins. Lo derech hatmana. I don't insulate it. I just place it on an oven. Umenicha omed agabe kira, and I leave it there on the oven. Uveshabbos notam yakira, and the goal is to remove it from the fire, remove it from the oven when Shabbos begins. That is the definition of shehiyah. Shehiyah is, I have a cholent, which I put on an element before Shabbos begins. I have a chicken soup I place on my stovetop before Shabbos begins. I have chicken, which I place into my oven before Shabbos begins. Those are all cases of shehiyah. Okay? V'chazara, what is chazara? Mikri refers to shenicham me'erev Shabbos al gabe kira. It's when I have something on an oven or on a heating element when Shabbos begins. Uv'Shabbos notlo mehakira, and on Shabbos I remove it from the oven. V'rotze lahachzira shenis lagabe kira, and later on I want to put it back on that heating element. So chazara would be, I take off my cholent Friday night. So some people like eating cholent Friday night, typically young people with stomachs of steel and all that good stuff. So basically they want to have cholent on Friday night. It's a big yeshiva bachra thing to do. They'll take off the cholent Friday night, they'll take some cholent, and now they want to put it back. That's called chazara, all right? Returning it. So again, there is shehiyah, leaving something on the fire when Shabbos begins. That is defined as shehiyah. And there is chazara, where I take something off of the fire on Shabbos. Fire by fire, I mean element. I take it off the fire on Shabbos, and then I want to put it back. That's what we're going to be discussing. Okay? And here we have Uplige Chananya v'Rabbanan. And there is a debate, there's a machlokas between Chananya and the Rabbanan. These are two Tanaim, these are two Tanaic opinions. These are opinions that go back to the times of the Mishnah, and they go like this. The Chananya Svirle, Chananya holds like this. Imatavshil kvar nisbashel kimachal ben drusai. If the food is already cooked, what is known as ma'achal ben drusai. Okay, we saw this term earlier. Ben Drusai was a bandit. Okay, it's not a term we use very often. Basically, he was a guy who stole and killed people. Okay, he was someone who was on the run all the time. Now, if you're on the run he was like this notorious, he was like the Al Capone or whatever, some crazy murderer. Okay, and he's always on the run. If you're always on the run, how do you prepare your food? Okay, you prepare it to the point that it's just barely good enough. That's how much you prepare it. So, but at that point, it's edible. You eat it. You don't wait. Ben Drusai was not sitting around making sure his steaks were well done. He didn't have the time for that because he was constantly running from the authorities. So when we say ma'achal ben Drusai, we mean the minimal amount of cooking or baking that's needed in order for something to be edible. Okay, so I don't know who this guy was, but his name now becomes it's funny because he's like this terrible guy, but we always remember his name in the context of halacha. It's pretty interesting. Okay, bottom line is that there is this, Chananya holds that as long as the food has been cooked enough, kema'achal ben drusai, enough that a ben drusai person would eat it, just barely cooked enough that a person would eat it, then at that point, which is how much? Which is kechatzi bishul, which is either half the amount of time of regular cooking. Okay, so meaning, let's say how long does it take to bake a chicken? 2 hours? Sounds reasonable? Yeah? Feel free to correct me. 1 hour. Okay, I'm going to go 2, depends on the chicken.
No, it depends on when it's covered.
Okay, so I'm not very good at math, so we're going to go with my example of 2 hours because it's going to make my life a lot easier, okay? So if it's 2 hours, which is 120 minutes, right? So then we're going to have machal ben drusai is going to be half, 60 minutes, it's edible. It's edible at 60 minutes. So if it takes you an hour to cook your chicken, then a half hour will be enough. It takes an hour and a half, 45 minutes is going to be enough, right? The point is, it's half. There is an opinion who says even a third of the way cooked. So in my example, which is 120 minutes, 40 minutes in, that would be machal ben drusai. Chananya holds, at that point, once you cross that threshold before Shabbos, okay, mutter la'ashos al gabe kira, you are allowed to leave it on the oven, afilim in a grufa min gachalim, even though the coals, now again, we're talking about an ancient oven. Oven was not coils. An oven oven had coals. So even if the coals are there, vena ketuma, and the coals are not covered with any substance, that is, you're allowed to leave your food on the oven as long as it was a halfway cooked. We'll go with the more stringent view. So again, according to Chananya, if a person has chicken, it's a few minutes, an hour before Shabbos, they say, oh no, I have more guests, I didn't prepare enough. And they say, well, it's only an hour. It takes me 2 hours to prepare my chicken. So according to Chananya, that's fine. Because I could throw it in, put it in the oven, and since it's going to be halfway cooked when Shabbos begins, i.e. machal ben drusai, it's the amount which is edible. It's at that point, it's an hour cooked, and then I'm allowed to leave it in the oven, and I don't have to, there's no issue leaving it in the oven. Now let's take a step back and just understand, what would be the issue of leaving raw food in the oven cooking? The issue is that there's a concern that, if you ever bake something, so when I put something in the oven for, I put it in and I forget about it, and if I didn't have a timer, I would never check on it again, right? But if you know what you're doing, then what do you sometimes do? You check on it, right? Sometimes it's getting, depends on the ingredients. Sometimes you want to check on it. Is it ready? Is it not ready, right? Right? Is that... Yeah, everyone's staring at me. Yeah, okay, you check on it. You want to make sure it's good, right? So there's a concern. If I check on it, sometimes it's going a little bit for whatever reason, right? Sometimes different things are happening. I have to turn the temperature down. I have to turn the temperature up. Certainly, we have pretty sophisticated ovens, which I put in the exact temperature I need. Imagine in a world, and we still check on it. Imagine a world where you're cooking with coals, right? It's not very precise, and there's a serious concern. If your food is not fully prepared, then I might go ahead and stoke the coals, right? Which on Shabbos, and that is a biblical violation. So there is this general concern of leaving raw food on an oven. Comes along Chananya and says, but if it's halfway cooked, if it's edible, at that point, I'm not going to mess around with it. If it's not cooked at all when Shabbos begins, if it's only a bit cooked, it's a fifth of the way cooked, then I'm still thinking about it. But as long as it's half the way cooked, I'm not going to be so concerned that I'm going to mess around with it. So therefore, Chananya says, as long as it got a halfway cooked when Shabbos began, I don't have to, then I'm allowed to leave it in the oven, even though you might argue I might still adjust it. He's not worried about that. We'll see there are those who disagree, okay? But now you're seeing what the issue is, okay? V'chachamim svir lahu, the rabbis disagree. The chachamim say, da'aser, it is forbidden in eina grufa uktuma, unless it is either the coals are shoveled out or the coals are covered with a form of with ashes, okay? Elam kenis bashal kol tzarko umitztamik viralo. Unless it is fully cooked, and any further cooking would actually be detrimental to the item. So the chachamim come along and they say, if it's halfway cooked, you're still concerned. I want it to be perfect. And therefore the chachamim say, until it's fully cooked, until it's sitting on the fire in a way that is either fully cooked, and the only way that if it stays longer, it's actually going to get worse for it, then we say, okay, a person's not going to go ahead and stoke the coals. But if as long as it's not fully cooked, the chachamim are concerned that I'm going to go ahead and stoke the coals. Right? You with me? So basically, we have like this. So, let's just make this practical. Person goes ahead. It's before Shabbos. And they realize an hour before Shabbos they didn't bake their chicken, which takes 2 hours to bake. And they want to bake that chicken in their oven, right? So two people, so you have, one person calls Chananya, okay? And Chananya says, no problem, because it's going to be halfway cooked. It's edible enough at that point. I'm not concerned that you're going to adjust the knob / stoke the coals, and therefore you can put that chicken in. It's going to be an hour cooked as long as it's edible. Machal Bendrusa, it's halfway cooked by that time, no problem. The Chachamim say an hour, it's not enough. If you had called me 2 hours, an hour before, 2 hours before Shabbos, in which case it would be fully cooked. Actually, they would say even more than that, because the Chachamim say the only time you're allowed to leave food on the fire, uncovered fire before Shabbos, is when the food is fully cooked, and even sitting there is not going to make it better, it's only going to make it worse. Then you can leave it on the fire, which anyways, you'd want to take it off the fire, right? But the point is that even if it's fully cooked, and it's still going to get better, right? Sometimes you can have something which is fully cooked, but it depends on your taste. You want it to be a little brown, right? A little more brown. Then the Chacham would say, still, not good enough. It's only when it's fully cooked, and now leaving it's going to start burning it, then the Chacham say, you can leave it. Which basically means, they're basically not allowing you to leave any food that's not fully cooked on a fire, unless and again, let's talk about the ancient fires. Unless the coals of that oven are shoveled out, in which case the coals are shoveled out, then the concern of you stoking them no longer exists, right? So the oven's still going to remain hot, right? It's not going to be boiling hot, but if you take the coals out of a contained container, right, then it's still going to be hot, it'll still be cooking, but the whole concern of a person stoking the coals are not going to exist because the coals are shoveled out. Or, a little more lenient, they say if you cover the coals with ashes, then that's okay. Now, what does that do? There are different opinions. The most straightforward opinion is that by covering it with ashes, it's a reminder not to mess around with it. Meaning, when you're done with a fire, if you ever make like a bonfire, when you're done with it, one of the ways to finish, to get rid of it is to take something which is going to extinguish it, right on top. You put ashes on top of it, and that extinguishes it. So the fire might still be there, but it's causing the fire to diminish, and that'll serve as a reminder, I'm done with this fire, right? So the Chachamim say, you call me now, you call the Chachamim an hour before Shabbos with this chicken, which it needs 2 hours to cook. The Chacham will say you can't put it in the oven unless you turn the oven off, which you're not going to want to do, or you cover the element somehow, or cover the knob somehow. We'll have to get into that, right? Let's keep in mind, before I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but in the ancient world, the item which produced the heat is the same exact item which you would stoke in order to increase the heat. Nowadays, there's an element, there's an oven, there's a crock pot, and there's a knob. They're two separate spaces, right? So when we think about what the modern equivalence is of covering the fire with ashes, do you cover the element, which is the source of heat, or do you cover the knob, which is where the equivalent to the stoking, right? So we'll get into that later on, but that's something just to start thinking about as we think ahead. Okay, yes?
So then the real issue here is not the cooking, it's the, put a fence around.
Correct.
So you won't come to do something that's really...
Yes. Thank you for highlighting that. In other words, if I put raw chicken in my oven before Shabbos begins, biblically, I'm not doing anything. Cooking means I went ahead on Shabbos and put it on a fire. If I placed something before Shabbos, I didn't do anything, biblically speaking. I didn't cook. The concern is, since it's raw, I may go ahead and adjust the flame, which would be biblically prohibited, and that's where this whole discussion comes around. Okay, so again, let's review. Hananya says if it's halfway cooked, if it's like a halfway, meaning time-wise, halfway cooked, I could then leave it on an exposed fire. And the Chachamim say, unless it is fully cooked and staying on the fire is going to be bad for it, I'm concerned that I'm going to stoke the coals / adjust the elements, and therefore the only way I can put it on a fire is if the fire is covered in some way. In the ancient world, that means placing ashes on top of it or removing the coals entirely. Okay? Who do we rule like? Big nafkamina, right? I gave you a scenario where I called the Chum and Chananya. Practically speaking, this happens, right? If it ever happened to you, you forgot like an hour before Shabbos, whatever it was, and you have some food you want to cook. Are you allowed to put it in an oven or not? Do we paskin like Chananya or like the Chachamim? Guess what? It's a debate. Okay, so let's see. Upasku harifa Rambam. We're now the second to last paragraph on page 121. Upasku harifa Rambam va'omdim b'shitasam. And the Rif, the Rambam, and those who hold like them, these are typically the Sephardic, the Rif, Rav Yitzchak Alfasi, and the Rambam, these are like typical Sephardic psak. They hold kirabanan de Chananya. They hold like the rabbis who argue with Chananya. Dafilu lishos, even to leave something on the fire before Shabbos, be'inan agabe grufa viktuma. The only way you can leave something not fully cooked on a fire is if the fire is covered or there is no fire at all. The coals have been shoveled away. Tosfos pasku, and Tosfos, that's the more Ashkenazic ruling. They rule lashos mutter afilu al ena grufa mishenis bashal kemachal ben drusai ukechananya. Tosfos holds like Chananya, saying that as long as it's halfway cooked, I'm allowed to leave it on the fire. Again, so if you were to call the Rambam Maimonides, he would say you can't put it on the fire unless the fire is fully covered. And if you call Tosfos, he would say the Tosafist, it's a group of people actually. He would say that as long as it's halfway cooked, he goes like Hanani, you'd be allowed to leave it on the fire. So far, so good. Okay, Vehain hashtei deo shuhuv v'shulchan aruch. Okay, the Shulchan Aruch does something very interesting over here. Normally, the Shulchan Aruch's goal is to make things easy for us. Sometimes, for you and I, it makes it a little bit confusing because he doesn't bring down one opinion; he brings down two opinions. And then the question is, which one does he actually want us to hold like? In this case, he brings down both opinions. Das echad, he das a rifa Rambam. He first brings down the opinion saying the stringent view that unless something is fully cooked, you can't leave it on an exposed fire. Vayesh omrim shemevi amechaber b'sof sif aleph. Who das Rashi v'Tosfos anal? Then he goes and says, and there are those who say, and he quotes the more lenient view, that of Tosfos. Zeh ma sheba'arna b'ktsara. Okay, fine. Let's just stop over here. Fine. So basically, Shulchan Aruch brings down both views. We'll have to see what do we actually rule like. Okay. Now, with that introduction, let's learn some of the primary sources, and then we're going to get. Then we'll jump ahead to the psak, the later sources, and how we actually rule. Okay. Good. So far, so good. Okay. A lot of details, but not so confusing. Yeah, good. Okay, so let's now look. So first of all, you have on page 122, you have a picture of the kira. You see that? That is what their ovens looked like back in the day. That is the classic oven. And as we'll see, this type of oven, the poskim see is most comparable to our modern day ovens. Okay, so basically it had a cavity in the middle where you put the food in. Where you put the fire in, and then it had two holes at the top, and you'd put the food on those holes as a way of heating up the food. Or it's like basically like a stovetop with like fire on the bottom and two holes on the top. As we'll see again, we'll compare that most to an oven. Okay? So let's see the Mishnah. It's a Mishnah in Shabbos which says like this. Kira shesik.
So was the food put inside?
Typically the food was placed on top. On those two holes. Yeah. Okay. Kira shesikua bekashu v'gvava. Let's say you have a stove, this kira, which was lit up before Shabbos. They write on Shabbos, which is a mistake. It means before Shabbos.
They said Shabbos eat.
Oh, the next line is going to be a mistake. Okay, fine. You're right. Here's Shishku B'Kashu B'Bava. You have a fire that was lit with straw or with rakings. Okay, straw and rakings are real. If you're trying to make a fire, you don't want to make a fire with straw. Why? Because straw gets lit right away, but it burns out right away, right? So basically, it's like a lousy fire. Then Nostam Aleh Tafshel, you can place uncooked items on that fire before Shabbos because there's no concern you're going to stoke anything because there's not going to be a fire in a few minutes. So we're not worried in that case. However, begefes uve'etzim, with like pulp or with wood, which is a typical way of lighting up these fires, lo yitain ad sheyigrov, and if you cannot place food on this fire before Shabbos until you either shovel out the coals, or you cover the coals with ashes. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Okay, now the thing is like this. The Mishnah says you can't place food there, but it's not so clear. Are we talking about initially placing it before Shabbos begins? Or are we talking about it? This is going to confuse you all, but just hold on tight, okay? Or that's the simple understanding of this Mishnah. But there's another way of reading this Mishnah. That maybe this Mishnah is not talking about the case of before Shabbos, but rather it's talking about a case where I took it off, meaning before Shabbos the oven was covered. Or whatever, before Shabbos there was food on an oven, and then I took it off. Am I allowed to yitin? Am I allowed to replace it on Shabbos? Right? Remember, there's two scenarios. There's something called shikiyah, which we've been talking about until now, which is placing something initially before Shabbos begins. And there's something called chazara, where you have food on a fire, I take it off the fire, and now I want to return it to the fire. Is this Mishnah talking about scenario number one, leaving food on the fire before Shabbos begins? Or is it talking about removing things from the fire and returning it to the fire when Shabbos already started? Yeah? No? Go ahead.
I'm not understanding the Hebrew well enough. I'm looking at the English. And he's talking about, it says you can place a pot of cooked food atop it on Shabbos.
So
That's chazara.
so that's chazara, right? So it's a little bit, it shouldn't have said anything because it's a little bit ambiguous, as we're about to see. Meaning,
What is the Hebrew actually?
the Hebrew doesn't say anything. That's the problem. Meaning it says, the gefis of eitzim lo yitin, you cannot place it. Doesn't say on Shabbos, doesn't say before Shabbos, just says you cannot place it. So is it saying you cannot place it before Shabbos begins? Right? In which case we'd be going like which opinion, Hanani or the Rabbanan? Like the Rabbanan, right? Because the Rabbanan we'd say it has to be partial, the Rabbanan has to be full, you have to have it covered. Or does it mean you can't replace it on Shabbos? Meaning, we're not even talking about before Shabbos. We're only talking about a case where I took it off on Shabbos, and I want to put it back. Let's say it's more common for cholent. I had cholent on a fire. I had cholent on my elements. I took it off, and I want to put it back. And to put it back, I have to go ahead and cover it. That even Hanania holds. Hanania says to put something back on Shabbos, you need the oven to be covered.
This doesn't even say whether the food.
It doesn't get into the food. Correct. It doesn't get into the food. We're going to make
How much it was cooked. In
Correct.
other words.
Correct.
So this is really.
It's very ambiguous. Very ambiguous. Correct. So if you look on page 123, the reason this is brought in is just because this, when you have a Mishnah, just the background behind this. The Mishnah is when you have a Mishnah, the author of the Mishnah is a man by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. He went ahead and he codified all the different halachos, and sometimes he lists in a Mishnah that you have a debate. He says, Rabbi Meir says this, Rabbi Kiva says that, Rabbi Shmuel says this, okay. But sometimes he lists something just plain. He just says, this is the halacha. Now, we know, by doing our research, that point that he just said straight up is actually a matter of debate. So why did Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi just say it straight, without saying this opinion and that opinion? It's his way of telling us this is the law. Because if he'd say, Rabbi Meir says this, you'd say, oh, Rabbi Meir says this, but someone must disagree. When he says something just plain, the implication is that this Mishnah is the halacha. This is the ruling. And therefore, the way to read this Mishnah has great ramifications. Right? In other words, if the implication of this Mishnah if this Mishnah, again, this Mishnah doesn't say this person says this person says that, he just writes it in a straight way. And so the question is, when we read this Mishnah, is it going like the Rabbanan, who are saying that you can't place something on the oven before Shabbos begins unless the oven is covered? Or is it going like the opinion of Hanania, saying that before Shabbos, you could place anything on the oven, as long as Machal Ben Drusai. But we're talking over here about returning something to the oven, and that's what the Mishnah is focusing on, in which case the Mishnah will be going like Hanania. Okay?
But it's ambiguous. So then
It's ambiguous, right? So the Gemara basically leaves that. I mean, we're not going to read the Gemara inside, but the Gemara ultimately leaves it points out that this Mishnah could go either way. In other words, right? So this is just
Okay.
sidebar, right? There are going to be other sources. I think the AC just went off, and I'm going to pass out if we don't, not literally. Let's go, but I'm just going to turn the AC back on if that's okay. Give me 1 second. Sorry. Don't know how people survived in the ancient world. Okay. All right. Okay. Yes, this Mishnah is ambiguous. I just mentioned this just to learn, to understand why there's this type of discussion around it, because when you have a Mishnah, what's called a Stam Mishnah, you have a Mishnah that's just mentioned without any credit to any particular person. That is very important for us. The problem is over here, it's still ambiguous. Yes?
So when you say that if he doesn't give any author, that's the halacha, is it because he decided that's the halacha, or that was commonly decide? Like, is he making these?
He is making the decision. The question is, how is he making the decision? Presumably based on this is the consensus of some people, and he's also a little bit of both. A little bit of both. In other words, he has the credibility. His view is an authoritative view.
And everyone would have accepted it in those days.
Typically. There are exceptions, but this is the general concept. But there are exceptions. There's also an additional piece over here, and that you find in the Gemara as well. There's a general principle that when it comes, there are like different eras. Okay, this is just like a sidebar. It's important to conceptualize like how halacha works. Sorry.
You should give a class on
One of these days. I once gave a full Shavuos night, so it's not going to be like a short class, but it's fascinating to understand the halachic process.
a long class.
Yeah. A whole series of classes. Okay, fair enough. Maybe. So just one sidebar, because it's important. And that is that we have a concept, a very interesting concept. There's like this tension. On the one hand, we say we have a lot of respect in Jewish law for those who come before us. Right? We have in other words, there is an era known as the era, let's just say the Gemara. Right? In other words, you and I don't care. Well, forget us. Okay? Rav Moshe Feinstein, great, humongous scholar. He can't argue with the Gemara. Too bad. It happened. As soon as the Gemara is solidified, he's not going to argue. We have this respect for that became before us. At the same time, there is this other concept that when it comes to, and there are different eras. There's the era of the era of the Gemara, okay, and then there's the era known as the era of the Rishonim, which basically goes from the year 1000 to the year 1500. Okay, we're skipping over an era, the Gaonim, which for whatever reason doesn't play as much of a role for our halachic practices. But from the era of 1000 to around 1500, you have Maimonides, the Rambam, Rashi, Ramban, Tosos. Those are all living during that era, and those are and what we find. And then you have what's known as the Achronim, which is from 1500 and on. Okay, so those are all independent eras. We typically don't argue from era to era. People in the Achron, in this era, will not be able to argue with someone in the era before them. However, within the era itself, there is this concept that we do typically not always, but go with the Basrai, the latter ones. So let's just forget the Rishonim Achron for a second. You look at the Gemara. So sometimes you'll have a bunch of different opinions on one page of Gemara. Who do we go like? So the rule that most of the poskim assume is that the last opinion is the one that we ultimately rule like. Why is that?
The last one.
The last meaning chronologically, meaning the last one who lived. Similar to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi being the author of the Mishnayos, he's not only a very important person, he lives at the end of the Mishnaic period. And therefore, he brings it all that. So why is that significant? Is because you've had a chance to listen to everyone else. Right? Because now that I've heard all the meaning, if I said my opinion, I said it in a vacuum. But then I hear you and oh, you know what? Forget my opinion. I'm going to go with your opinion. So the person all the way at the end of that era, although era to era, we're going to give credence to the earlier eras, but within an era, the ones who come at the end of that era actually in some ways have much more credibility and authority, I should say, much more authority because the fact that they had the chance to hear everyone else. So typically we're going to go with that latter view. Okay? Sidebar. One day we should come back to this. Agreed. Okay. Make sense? Okay, fine. So says the Rambam. Let's turn the page to page 124. Let's see how the Rambam rules about this debate. We already saw a hint to this from the Mishnah Berurah. If you look on page 124, source number 3, he says like this, Tafshil, we'll skip the first words, how so? Ketza, Tafshil shelo bishel kol tzarko. Let's say you have food which wasn't fully cooked. V'chamin shelo huchmu kol tzarkan, or hot water, which wasn't boiled. O tafshil shabishel kol tzarko, or even if it was fully cooked, v'chol zman shemitztamik hu yafilo. Let's say it's a steak which is fully cooked, but it could still sit on the fire for a while longer. Okay, we're on page 124, source 3. Ein mashin oso al gabi ha'esh b'Shabbos. You are not allowed to leave it on a fire on Shabbos. Afal pi shehunach mi ba'od yom, even though it was left there before the day began, before Shabbos began. Why? Gezerah, a decree, shema yichateh b'gechalim. You might stoke the coals. Kedei lahashlam bishulo, in order to finish up the cooking, o kedei letzamko, or to improve it. Okay, lefikach, therefore, im garaf ha'esh, if a person swept out the fire, meaning swept out the coals, o shekisa esh hakira be'efer, or the person covered the fire with ashes, or as pishtan adako sha'amu agachalim. Okay, so or a person covered it with flax, or the coals have died down. Sharihin kemechusos be'efer, that's like it's covered. O shisiku bekasha begvava, or it's covered with different products. O begali behema, was covered with dung. Okay, this people did it back in the day. Shari ein sham gechalim bo aros. At that point, the coals are no longer burning. Harazem mutter lahashos aleha. Then you're allowed to leave food on it. Why? The fact that it's covered, you demonstrated you're not interested in stoking these coals. In other words, if the second I cover it with something, that demonstrates I'm not going to be messing around with this because I've covered it. I show I have no interest in it. And there's no decree that I might stoke the coals. So who is the Rambam ruling like? Hanania or the Rabbanan? The Rabbana, the more stringent view, he says that if something, unless something is fully cooked, or I'm leaving it on the fire, it's going to get worse. I'm not allowed to leave it on the fire. I have to go ahead and cover it. If I don't cover it, I can't leave it on the fire. So Svardim, it would seem, based on this Rambam, it would seem you would not be allowed to go ahead and leave that chicken in. You have an hour before Shabbos, and it takes 2 hours for the chicken to cook. You would not be able to put it into the oven because of the concern that I might go ahead and stoke the coals, because the Rambam, Maimonides, it was ruling like the Rabbanan. Okay, Rashi, source number 4 says, "Anan we dimashinan keder gabe kira shena grufa, we who leave pots on a stove that is not swept out or not covered, ad chananya samchinan. We rely on chananya." Now you'll notice that's interesting terminology. If you were writing that you hold like chananya, what would you say? I say we should do this because we hold like chananya. I wouldn't say you could rely, right? Sometimes you hear, if you listen to someone ask a question, you say, you could rely on this opinion, right? That's not the same as saying, this is the opinion, right? There's a difference. When Rashi says, ad chananya samchinan, he's saying like, it does sound a little bit interesting. He's saying like, you could rely on it. Is he saying this is the ideal opinion? Not so clear. He's saying, we rely on it. Okay, because elsewhere there's a Gemara that goes like him. Kira Amar, fine. He quotes another Gemara, which talks about a scenario where you leave bread attached to an oven. Okay, so back in the day, one of the ways they would bake bread is they wouldn't put it on a rack, they would attach it to the wall of the oven, right? You can still see some places in the Middle East, they do this, where they attach like pizzas or different things to an oven, and then the Mishnah, there's an earlier Mishnah in Masechah Shabbos which says that as long as it gets a little crispy on one side, then you can leave it in the fire, even though, right, you know, like in your ovens, right, if the bottom of your challah gets baked brown, it gets brown first probably, right? The top is not brown. Is that fully baked? No, it's not. The fact that it says you're allowed to leave it in the oven if only part of it is baked sounds like who, Chananya or the Chachamim? Chananya, the more lenient view. So we see there's another, even though that Mishnah we saw earlier is ambiguous, there's another Mishnah which Rashi's arguing is very clear like Chananya, and therefore he and the Ashkenazim rule, although I'll say rule/rely on Chananya, the more lenient view. Okay? Okay. So let's now see a little bit further about how we actually rule. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch, as we alluded to before, as we saw before, really brings down both views. Let's just read it inside together. Let's look on page 125, source 7. This is how the Shulchan Aruch brings down these views. It says the Shulchan Aruch, Kira, an oven, Shihi Asui Kigedera, which is shaped like a pot. Okay, you have a stove that's shaped like a pot. Vishofsin al Pia Kidera Lamala. Basically, you have like this something which looks like this, like an upside down pot, and then you place a pot on top of it, right? Their oven was an upside down pot with some holes in it, right? And then they placed a pot on top of it. V'yeshba makom shvisa shtei kederos, there's a place on top for 2 pots. Im huska begefesh upsola shel zeisim b'eitzim, if you fired it up with pulp or wood, which is good coals. Asr litin aleh tafshel b'od yom l'shosor aleha, you are not allowed to leave food on that fire, even if you placed it before Shabbos. Ella imkenis vashal cold sarko uvimitzdamik varalo, unless it's fully cooked, and leaving it on the fire now is actually going to be detrimental to it. Which means, like, I don't know why you would do so, but that's the only time halachically you'd be allowed to leave it on the fire. If the chicken is really well done now, and leaving it on the fire is going to make it worse, then you can leave it there. In that case, we're not concerned that you're going to stoke it. Aval, however, if it was cooked partially, and it was not fully cooked, and even if it was cooked fully, and it's leaving it on the fire is still going to benefit it, it's going to be helpful to it. We're concerned going to stoke the coals, and it is forbidden to leave something on it, unless you shoveled out the coals, you removed all the coals, or you covered it, you added ashes, and look what he says, in order to lessen the heat. Just parenthetically, you notice the Rambam, how did the Rambam say? The reason, by adding the ashes, what was the point? It demonstrates you have nothing to do with it, right? There's really like 2 ways of looking at the covering. Is it that it's demonstrating that I'm done, like it's like a reminder, like I have nothing to do with this? Or is it actually functioning as lessening the heat? Now, in their days, it doesn't make a difference, because by placing ashes on top of it, it functions as both a reminder. I placed ashes on top of my coals, it functions as a reminder, but adding ashes also lessens the heat, because it brings the heat down. In the modern era, where again, you have 2 elements, if I cover the elements, okay, it depends what I cover with, right? Is it actually going to lessen the heat? Let's pretend that foil is going to lessen the heat. Maybe by a fraction of a thing. I don't know. Not after a while. It's not going to, because it's going to catch whatever. But let's even say it lessens the heat, right? But it doesn't. But it doesn't do anything to the knob, right? And if I cover the knob, maybe it's a reminder, but I'm not lessening the heat. right? So which one do you have to cover, right? Modern era, do you have to do both, right? So it's a big... You get a blech that does both. Okay, then you cover all your bases, right? Okay, but so it's just something worth thinking about when you see these gemaras, how to apply it to the modern era, right? Okay, but let's come back to that. V'yesh omrim, turn the page 126, says Shulchan Aruch, there are those who say, shekol shenisbashal kemachal ben drusai, as long as it's partially cooked, or it's fully cooked and leaving it on the fire is okay, it gets it better. Mutter lash osla gabikir. There are those who say that you're allowed to leave this on the fire. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch, remember, he brings both opinions, both the stringent opinion and the lenient opinion. Says the Rama, v'nahagula hakel kisvara achrona, and the custom is to be lenient like the latter view. So again, is the Rama saying go with the latter view? Not so clear, right? The Rama saying the custom is to be lenient, like the first view. He doesn't fully embrace the lenient view, okay? It's just interesting that when he frames it, he doesn't embrace the lenient view. He kind of acknowledges the lenient view and says you could go with it. And the Be'er Halacha, we're not going to see it inside, the Be'er Halacha kind of unpacks this and says, yes, even though the Rama and even the Shulchan Aruch are saying that this lenient view exists, and you could go with this lenient view, it doesn't seem like they're fully embracing it. They're saying, it's okay, it's a minhag, it's an acceptable minhag. People do this, it's acceptable. But if you ask him, like, what's the ideal thing for a person to do? It sounds like he's suggesting that we don't do it. Okay, that seems to be the way, sorry, yeah.
Is that really how you're reading the Ramah? I mean, it sounds like, well, most people do it this way and it's okay, but if you really want to be like...
Machmir. So then he would say, the fact is, v'nagu lahakel, the fact that he says it is, the minhag is to be lenient. I'll just read the, look at the Be'er Halacha, which certainly takes this approach. If you look at the Be'er Halacha in source number 8, we'll see it inside now. So he says, look at the second paragraph. He says, ach mikol makom, ein banu koach limchos, where is it? 1 second. Let's just start from the beginning. Fine. Source number 8, let's start from the beginning. V'nagu lahakel kisvar rishona. I am Beis Yosef. Look at the Beis Yosef. Sheherech harbe be'elu ashtei deos. He has a long piece, writes at length about these two views. V'hetek divir harash, and he quotes the Rash Kasav, Dibipnei Yisrael adukim mitzvahs onik Shabbos. Since the Jewish people are so connected to the laws of having pleasure and joy on Shabbos, they're not going to listen to us, we're going to be stringent, right? Meaning you see all the views that were quoted about the leniency, like Rashi said, right? Remember Rashi said, you could rely on. The Rush says, since the Jewish people are so into having delicious food on Shabbos, they're not going to listen to us. We say, introduce this more stringent view, they're going to ignore us. Therefore he says, hanach lahem, leave them alone. Right? So that certainly is saying it that way. It's only because that he didn't want to, protest. The fact that he brings the first view as this is the view. The second view, b'shem yesh omrim. He says, but there are those who say, if I tell you, this is the law, but there are those who say X. Right? The law is Y, there are those who say X. Which one is the one that I really am focusing on? Y. Sorry, I should have done X and Y. I'm sorry, I'm mixing it up. Okay, but the point is that when I say, and there are those who say, it's kind of diminishing it. So the Shulchan Aruch, certainly he's saying, really likes the more stringent view. Okay? He says, Ach mikol makom, ein banu koach limchos b'mekilin. He says, we don't have the ability to protest against those who are lenient. Shekvar nagu am ke yesh omrim. This is the way of practice. V'chmoshkas v'rama, as the Rama wrote, v'alkein, therefore, lefizeh lechatchila. Ideally, bevadei tov lizaher, shemevushal kol tzarko, kodem chashecha, l'salko min ha'esh. Ideally, you want to have your food fully cooked and removed from the fire. Achim ira, shenis acher hadavar. Let's say something came up where you got some delays. You get a knock on the door 20 minutes, an hour before Shabbos. Hi, we're not coming this week. Has that ever happened to you? That's the best. Okay, someone comes to your house and right? And like, oh no, we have no food. So what do you do an hour before Shabbos? Right, you quickly throw something in the oven, right? So you're all fahitz, you're all thrown off, right? So what do? You have what to rely upon, right? You have to cook something for them. That's the name of their oven. As long as by shkia, as long as by sunset, when Shabbos begins, it's going to be halfway cooked. And then you're allowed to leave it on there until the cooking is done. Okay, so again, we have the opinion of the Rabbanan, who say it has to be fully cooked, or you got to cover it. You have the opinion of Chananya, who says that as long as it's halfway cooked, you're allowed to leave it in the oven. Okay, and we have a lot of Ashkenazi poskim saying we could rely on the more lenient view, but they're not embracing it, fully. And therefore, what we're coming out with is that ideally, and this is the way that most poskim lands, ideally, we really want to have our food fully cooked before Shabbos begins. Your chicken should not be in the oven, not fully cooked when Shabbos begins. Okay, you want to have it fully cooked. If you had a scenario where someone came knocking on your door, or it's a short Shabbos, whatever, things happen, right? And you're stuck, okay. You certainly have what to rely upon, but as long as it will be halfway cooked, right? So you have your challah, let's say. You have your challah that you want to put in the oven before Shabbos begins. And whatever, something came up, you messed up, and now you have your raw challah sitting there, and it takes a half hour to cook, right? And there's 15 minutes till Shabbos begins, right? So are you allowed to put in the oven? The answer is yes, because that's a time of need. Ideally, you want to bake the challah before Shabbos begins. But if you're stuck, you can put it in the oven 50, as long as it's there, let's say it takes a half hour for your challah to bake, you can put it on the oven 15 minutes before Shabbos. It's going to continue baking for another 15 minutes. Now, we haven't gone into a whole discussion. Now, first of all, obviously on Shabbos, I can't turn the oven off, right? But we're getting into a whole discussion about opening your oven door, right? So right, that's a whole discussion for another time. But in theory, let's say it's a stovetop. We'll make it simple. You have chicken soup, and it takes 2 hours to make your chicken soup ready, right? So when it's an hour before Shabbos, you forgot. So you throw the chicken soup together. It's 2 hours before Shabbos. It has an hour of time to cook. You're allowed to rely on that. You shouldn't. Ideally, your chicken soup should be fully cooked. But if you need to, you're stuck. As long as K'maichel Ben Drusai, as long as it's halfway cooked, you have what to rely upon. Yes.
I remember hearing, like, the cholent should be mostly cooked.
Right.
You could also put it in totally raw.
Correct. We're going to get into the whole raw thing. There's another. So with cholent, let's talk about cholent very briefly. We're going to talk a lot more about cholent in the days in the weeks to come. But with the cholent, it's a little more complicated because forget the fully raw case. But let's say you put your cholent in, I don't know, an hour before Shabbos, 2 hours before Shabbos. Someone asked the cook in Ner Yisrael, like, how long does it take for a cholent to be ready? I don't know. What would you say? So it's like edible.
It's very subjective.
It is subjective. It is subjective, right?
It
Depends on the
also
size of your
depends
cholent.
on how
Depends on the heat. Okay, fine. Let's just say, I don't know, 5 hours. Let's just say. I have no idea. Depends on the cholent. Let's give us. So very often, are you really putting your cholent in 5 hours before Shabbos? Some of you may do that. But let's say you don't. So what do? You could throw in raw meat, but even an easier solution. Right? What do we see until now? We saw this notion of garuf akatum. You either take out the coals. We're not taking out the coals over here, in this case the coils, but what you could do is you could cover it, right? You could cover the fire, and that is, right, the Rabbanan said, you can't put it in an exposed fire. But if I have raw chicken and I want to put it on their ancient fire, what do? I cover it with ashes, and then I put the chicken there, right? So we don't have a fire, we don't have ashes, but you could cover your crock pot, right? And we'll see what's the ideal way to cover it. Do you cover the elements or do you cover the knob? Okay, spoiler alert, according to many poskim, all you have to do is cover the elements, okay? Oh, I shouldn't say all you have to do, but that's like, so meaning what you would do if you want to be planful is regardless of when you make your cholent, what you could just do is basically go right now, go home before if you're cleaning up for Shabbos or whatever, take some foil and basically line the inside of your crock pot and then it's covered. Halachically, that is considered covered according to most poskim. We'll see there are different opinions about the knob and whatever, but according to most poskim, just covering the inside, meaning making sure the foil, the coils are covered. Take a few minutes, do it slowly, so it's covered nicely, and then you can just put your cholent in that before Shabbos. Doesn't matter how cooked it is, because even the Rabbanan who are more stringent said that when the fire is covered, in this case, your coil, your element is covered, then you're allowed to put food in that is not fully cooked.
They sell crock pots like that.
With a cover.
My crock pot is just, it's a pot, and you take the whole pot off, and it's like a blech. It's an electric blech. You just, they're using it in the shul I used to go to because.
Okay. So we'll talk about we'll get to those.
We're
gonna.
A West
Yeah. So there you just put on top. So we're talking about so fine.
That makes it really easy.
We'll get into blechs. Blechs are, we'll have to hold this. Let's assume we're not talking about blech. We're talking about someone who has a knob and.
The crock pot it's already covered. You don't see the.
You don't see the elements
at all. It's just a.
Okay, so we're going to get into. There's a couple of different things which are. There's some debate around some of those things, but let's just for now, for simplicity, we're going to get into much more detail in days to come. Now we have the principles, but just one practical takeaway from today is if you're making a cholent before Shabbos, you either have to make sure that it's fully cooked, whatever that means for you, before Shabbos, which could be a little annoying. Like let's say Shabbos is in the winter, your cholent's going to be maybe it will be burnt by the next day, so you don't want it to be like fully edible, when Shabbos begins. Maybe you don't want it to be. So what you could do, which is totally fine lechatchila, is cover your elements with foil, and then it's covered, and then you can put in the cholent whenever you want before Shabbos, because even the more stringent view says that is okay. Yes?
I don't know where I got this from. I thought it had to be 1/3 cooked, that if a thief came into your house, they would eat.
So that's what we're seeing over here, this idea of 1/3 or 1/2, but that's only if it's uncovered. If it's covered, it could be even less than that. Right? So that's the more stringent view, right? The more lenient view says as long as it's 1/3 or ideally 1/2 then you could leave it on the fire, uncovered, right? But sometimes it's going to be more than a half, less than a half, whatever it is. So the simplest thing to do, just good practice, it takes 2 minutes, and it's not going to get in your way. Just cover your bottom with foil, and then you could put your children's in there, even if it's completely raw, a little bit raw, whatever. There's no problem, because even the more stringent view says, as long as the element is covered with something, then you're allowed to cook. We're going to get into much more detail in the days to come. I'm not here again next Sunday, but God willing, for most of the rest of the summer, I should be here. So we'll pick up, but we have some of the principles, and we'll pick up on those, God willing, the weeks to come. Okay, Chodesh Tov, good Chodesh.